The Friday night rush at Metropolitan General was a storm of sirens and clinical urgency. Inside the crowded emergency room, a high-profile patient was rushed behind the double doors, clinging to life. A veteran police officer, determined and impatient, marched toward the restricted treatment area, demanding immediate access for his investigation. Standing in his path was Elena Ward, a quiet ER nurse with a gaze of pure steel. "You can't go in there," she stated firmly. The officer's face reddened as he loomed over her. "Who do you think you are?" The room froze. Then the Admiral walked in, and everything changed instantly. The truth revealed. Elena Ward was 31 years old, but in the sterile, high-pressure world of the Metropolitan General Emergency Room, she often felt like a veteran of 1,000 silent wars. Tonight, the air was particularly thick. The scent of ozone from the storm raging outside was mixing with the sharp, clinical bite of industrial antiseptic and the heavy metallic tang of fresh blood. Elena was the charge nurse for the night shift, the person responsible for the chaotic flow of the entire department. She wasn't a manager sitting safely in an ivory office. She was the anchor on the dirty linoleum floor, the one who decided who moved where, who got a bed, and who had to wait while their life hung by a thread. She was a woman of few words, known among the hospital staff for her unshakable, almost eerie calm and her meticulous, absolute adherence to protocol. To the junior residents who were drowning in their first rotations, she was a lifesaver. To the arrogant surgeons who thought they were gods, she was a necessary, irritating obstacle. But to the world outside those swinging glass doors, she was just another member of the staff, a background character in the drama of their lives, invisible until she said no. At 11:22 p.m., the double doors burst open with a violent bang. A trauma team scrambled in, their sneakers squeaking frantically against the floor, pushing a gurney with a patient who was barely breathing. The man was covered in road grime and dark, drying blood, but there was something fundamentally different about him. He had been brought in under a silent code, a rare designation used for individuals whose identity or mission was highly sensitive. He was immediately rushed into Bay 1, the most secure and well-equipped treatment area in the facility, shielded from the prying eyes of the public. Close on the heels of the gurney was Officer Miller. Miller was a veteran of the city's police force, a man with 25 years of service and a badge that he treated like a skeleton key to every lock in the city. He was frustrated. He was exhausted, and he was convinced that the man on the gurney held the only piece of evidence he needed to close a high-stakes investigation that had kept him awake for 48 hours. To Miller, the silent code was just a bureaucratic hurdle he intended to jump over with the weight of his authority. As the doctors began their frantic work inside the sterile confines of Bay 1, Miller attempted to push past the nursing station with a heavy, purposeful stride. Elena stepped out from behind the counter, her small frame becoming a physical barrier at the entrance to the restricted corridor. "Officer, I need you to stay back," she said, her voice low and steady, like a warning bell ringing in the distance before a landslide. Miller stopped abruptly, his brow furrowing in genuine disbelief. He looked at her wrinkled blue scrubs, then at her plain plastic ID badge, and then finally at her face, searching for a sign of hesitation that wasn't there. "I don't have time for this, nurse. That man is a primary person of interest in a major case. I need to be in that room for the initial assessment before he slips away." "I understand your urgency, officer," Elena replied, not moving an inch, her weight perfectly distributed on her feet. "But Bay 1 is a sterile environment, and the patient is currently hemodynamically unstable. According to hospital policy and the specific federal directive for this case, no one enters that area until the medical team gives the clear, and that clear hasn't come." The hallway was filled with the discordant sounds of beeping monitors, the hiss of oxygen tanks, and the distant, muffled shouting of other trauma teams. But between Elena and Miller, there was a sudden, vibrating silence. The other nurses paused their charting, watching the standoff from the corners of their eyes, their hearts racing. Miller took a long step forward, using his height and the bulk of his tactical vest to loom over Elena. He was a man used to people deferring to his authority, especially civilian support staff, who didn't understand the real-world consequences of a delayed investigation. To him, she wasn't a professional. She was just a bureaucrat in blue pajamas, standing in the way of the law. "Listen to me very carefully," Miller hissed, his voice trembling with a controlled, dangerous rage. "I have a job to do that involves public safety, and if you interfere with an active police investigation, there are serious legal consequences. Now, for the last time, get out of my way." Elena didn't blink. She didn't look at his silver badge, and she didn't look at the Glock on his hip. She looked directly into his dilated pupils, seeing the fatigue and the ego clashing within him. "My job is to protect the safety of the patients in this ward and the integrity of the medical environment. Those are the rules I enforce, regardless of who is asking to break them. You stay here." Miller's face turned a deep, mottled red. He couldn't believe the audacity of this staffer. The power dynamic in his head, built over decades of command, was being challenged by a woman who didn't even have a title he respected. "Who do you think you are?" he barked, the words echoing off the tiled walls and drawing the shocked attention of the entire waiting room. "You're just a nurse. Move!" If you think people are often challenged when they enforce rules, comment, "That is unfair." The tension in the ER was no longer just a feeling. It was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating weight that made the air feel thin and electric. Officer Miller stood his ground, his chest heaving under his uniform, his hand resting instinctively near his utility belt. He wasn't a bad cop. In his own mind, he was the hero of the story. He believed that the faster he got to that patient, the faster he could stop a killer or prevent another tragedy. He saw Elena not as a healer, but as a stubborn obstacle to safety. A person who was prioritizing red tape and hospital ego over the survival of the city. From his perspective, every second she spent arguing with him was a second that the trail went colder, a second that justice was delayed. He saw her unshakable calm as a form of arrogance, her unwavering adherence to rules as a lack of basic common sense. Elena, however, saw the room with a clinical, tactical clarity that Miller couldn't begin to comprehend. She knew the patient in Bay 1 wasn't just a person of interest. She had seen the monitors before she stepped out. She knew that he had a traumatic brain injury and a collapsing lung that was struggling against a tension pneumothorax. If Miller went in there with his loud, demanding voice and his aggressive energy, the sudden spike in the patient's intracranial pressure could be an instant death sentence. She also knew that the rules weren't just red tape. They were the structural foundation of a system that kept people alive when everything else was falling into chaos. If she broke the rules for a badge, she'd have to break them for a lawyer, then for a politician, then for the curious media. Elena was the barrier. She was the human shield. And she knew that once a shield develops even a single crack, it no longer protects anyone. "Not yet," Elena said, her voice cutting through Miller's rising anger with a clinical sharpness that physically surprised him. "Not yet?" Miller laughed, a bitter, dry sound that carried no humor. "I have the legal authority to conduct an investigation in any public facility in this district. I don't need your permission, Nurse Ward. I'm giving you an order. This is a private medical wing, and right now it is a high-risk surgical theater," Elena countered, her tone remaining flat and professional. "Legal authority does not override medical necessity or the biological survival of the patient. If you enter that room and the patient dies because of the distraction you cause, your investigation ends anyway. Is that the result you're looking for, officer? A corpse and a lawsuit?" Miller was momentarily silenced by the cold logic, but his ego was already too bruised, his adrenaline too high to retreat in front of an audience. He looked around the room, seeing the eyes of the staff, the interns, and the terrified patients on him. He felt like he was losing control of the room. The one thing a police officer is trained never, ever to let happen. "I've dealt with people like you before," Miller said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low volume that was meant to intimidate. "People who hide behind policy because they enjoy the small power trip it gives them. You think because you wear a stethoscope around your neck, you can tell a police officer how to do his job? You're making a huge mistake, Elena, one you won't be able to chart your way out of." The nurses at the station looked at each other, their hands hovering over their desk phones, ready to call hospital security or even a 911 dispatch for a code purple. But Elena raised a single finger, signaling them to stay back. She didn't want a scene. She didn't want a physical fight. She just wanted the men in Bay 1 to survive the night. "I'm not telling you how to do your job, Officer Miller," Elena replied, her eyes locked on his. "No, I'm telling you that you cannot do it here. Not right now. This floor belongs to the doctors and the dying. And right now, you are a distraction to both." Miller took another step, the soles of his heavy boots squeaking aggressively on the linoleum. "I'm going through that door. Move, or I'll have to assist you out of the way myself. And I'll book you for obstruction once the doctor is done." This was the line. Miller was now openly threatening physical force against a medical professional in the middle of her shift. The atmosphere shifted instantly from a procedural dispute to a crisis. The interns in the hallway stopped moving. The medical monitors seemed to beep faster, as if mirroring the heartbeats of everyone in the room. Elena didn't back down. She didn't even shift her stance. She stood as a fixed point in the middle of a world that was trying to push her aside. She knew she was right. She knew the protocol. And she knew that the truth didn't need to be loud to be powerful. As Miller reached out, his hand nearing Elena's arm, a sound echoed from the far end of the ER corridor. The sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps, not the squeak of a police boot or the shuffle of a nurse's clog, but the firm, unmistakable strike of polished military leather on concrete. The automatic doors of the ambulance bay slid open with a sharp hiss. A man stepped through, flanked by two people in plain clothes who moved with a terrifying, efficient grace. The man was older, his hair a shock of silver, but his posture was as straight as a spear. He was wearing a dark tailored suit, but everyone in that room knew exactly what he was before they even saw the gold stars hidden in his presence. He was an admiral, and he was walking straight toward the fire, with a gaze that could dismantle a mountain. If you realize conflict often comes from perspective, not intention, comment, "Tuai John Lamb." The energy in the emergency room didn't just shift. It collapsed into a state of total, heavy, and respectful silence. Admiral Silas Vance didn't have to shout. He didn't have to announce his rank or flash a badge. His presence was like a sudden, dramatic drop in barometric pressure. A weight that commanded every person in the room, from the janitor to the chief of surgery, to stop what they were doing and observe. Officer Miller, his hand still inches from Elena's arm, froze mid-motion. His tactical training kicked in, but it was overridden by a primal recognition of a superior predator. He recognized the face from a dozen national security briefings and 100 internal memos regarding Joint Task Force cooperation. He realized in a cold flash that the silent code patient in Bay 1 wasn't just a common criminal or a street witness. He was something far more significant to the federal government than a local police case. Admiral Vance stopped exactly 4 feet away from the nursing station. He didn't look at Miller first. He looked at Elena. He saw the way she was standing, shoulders back, feet planted in a defensive but non-aggressive stance, her expression as calm as a deep lake. He saw the barrier she had created, and he saw the professional integrity she was guarding with her own body. Then his gaze shifted slowly to Miller. It was a look that had humbled foreign dignitaries, silenced congressmen, and dismantled the egos of top-tier Special Forces commanders. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Vance asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a low-frequency resonance that seemed to vibrate in the bones of everyone listening. Miller swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry, his hand dropping back to his side as if it had been burned. "Admiral, no, sir. There was a minor procedural disagreement regarding immediate access to a high-priority person of interest." Vance's eyes narrowed just a fraction, a movement that felt like a death sentence. He didn't look at the patient's door. He kept his eyes locked on the officers. "I see. And was it your professional intention to use physical force against the charge nurse to resolve this minor disagreement?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing Miller had ever heard in his entire life. He felt the eyes of his fellow officers, the nurses, and the hospital staff burning into him. He realized in that agonizing moment that he wasn't the authority in this room. He was just a man who had forgotten the context of his surroundings, a man who had let his badge blind him to the mission. "No, sir. I was simply trying to ensure the investigation proceeded without delay." "The investigation," Vance interrupted, his voice turning as cold as the ice in a morgue, "is entirely secondary to the survival of the asset currently in that room. This is not a common crime scene, officer. This is a matter of national security involving a member of my personal command. And this nurse, she is doing her job to the letter of the law." The words "she is doing her job" hit the room like a holy benediction. It was the ultimate undeniable validation for Elena, but it was also a tactical correction for Miller. Vance wasn't just defending Elena's person. He was clarifying the reality of the hierarchy. The Admiral turned his full attention back to Elena, his expression softening by the smallest, most respectful of margins. "Nurse Ward, what is the current clinical status of the patient?" Elena didn't hesitate. She didn't stutter or look for approval from Miller. She answered with the same professional surgical precision she had used all night long. "Severe thoracic trauma, a suspected tension in pneumothorax, and potential neurological involvement, Admiral. We are currently stabilizing for immediate transport to the surgical suite. The trauma team needs exactly 3 more minutes of uninterrupted work before the first assessment report can be issued to your detail." Vance nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement that ended the debate. He looked back at Miller, his gaze dismissive. "You heard the nurse. 3 minutes. You will wait in the lobby, officer, and when the doctors are finished, you will submit your request for information through the proper military channels and the Department of Justice. Is that understood, or do we need to call your commissioner?" Miller's shoulders slumped, the weight of his vest suddenly feeling like 1,000 pounds. The fire of his anger had been completely extinguished by the cold, hard truth of the situation. He looked at Elena, seeing her for the first time not as a staffer, but as a top-tier professional who had been right from the very first second. He realized that she wasn't hiding behind policy to annoy him. She was using policy as a weapon to save a life he didn't even understand was at stake. "Understood, sir," Miller muttered, his voice barely audible. He took 2 steps back, his boots no longer sounding authoritative, but heavy with the weight of shame. Vance didn't watch him leave. He stayed at the nursing station, his eyes fixed on the doors of Bay 1, his hands clasped behind his back. He knew that the world was full of men like Miller, men who thought that strength was found in the volume of their voice or the weight of their badge. But he also knew that the world was actually saved by people like Elena, people who held the line in absolute silence, who valued the rules over their own comfort, and who understood that real power is the ability to stay calm when everyone else is shouting for control. "Thank you, Elena," Vance said quietly, his voice intended only for her ears. Most people in this city would have folded under that kind of pressure. "The 13th Command owes you a debt for your integrity tonight." Elena gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her face returning to its baseline of professional calm. "I was just following protocol, sir. It's what keeps the heart beating when the world gets loud." The doors to Bay 1 slid open with a soft, mechanical whir. The head surgeon stepped out, wiping a layer of sweat from his brow, and gave a simple thumbs up to Elena. The patient was stable. The window of time had been captured and held wide open. In the time it took to have a 3-minute argument, Elena Ward had saved a life, educated a veteran police officer, and earned the lifelong respect of a 4-star admiral. She didn't celebrate. She didn't smirk as Miller walked away with his head down. She simply picked up her black pen and began to document the exact time of stabilization. The mission wasn't over. The next ambulance was already arriving, and the shield had to remain strong for the next storm. If you believe clarity can resolve conflict faster than force, comment, I am indebted. The rest of the night was a blur of high-priority medical care and quiet, efficient movement. The patient from Bay 1 was eventually transferred to a secure military facility under the watchful eye of Vance's security team. The ER slowly returned to its standard level of chaos, the shouting of the intoxicated, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, and the endless, exhausting flow of human tragedy and triumph. Elena was back in her corner of the nursing station, her hair starting to come loose from its tight bun, her eyes burning with the deep fatigue of a 14-hour shift. She was finishing the final logs when a long shadow fell across her wooden desk. She looked up, expecting another resident with a question about dosages. It was Officer Miller. He had removed his police cap, and his expression was no longer mottled with rage or ego. He looked tired. He looked human. And he looked like a man who had spent the last 2 hours thinking about a single, 45-second interaction that had redefined his view of authority. "Nurse Ward," he said softly. He didn't use her first name this time. He used her title with a weight that suggested he finally understood what it meant. Elena put down her pen, her gaze neutral. "Yes, officer. I wanted to say understood," Miller said, his voice a low whisper that barely carried over the hum of the computers. "I was out of line earlier. I was so focused on the case and my own clock that I didn't see the patient. And I didn't see you." He paused, looking at his own weathered hands for a long moment. "You stood your ground against an Admiral's asset and a veteran cop's badge at the same time. I've been on the force for a long time, Elena, and I've never seen that much backbone in someone who doesn't carry a weapon." Elena gave him a small, weary smile, the first one of the night. "It's not about backbone, Officer Miller. It's about the patient. If I let you in when they are dying, I'm failing them. If I fail them, nothing else I do in this uniform matters. Not the badge, not the stars, and certainly not the investigation." Miller nodded slowly, a newfound bone-deep respect in his eyes. "I get that now. You weren't fighting me. You were fighting for him. I'm sorry for the 'who do you think you are' comment. I think I finally know the answer now." "We all have bad nights, Officer Miller," Elena said, her voice soft and forgiving. "Go home, get some sleep. The case will still be there in the morning, and the world will still be turning." Miller gave her a short, respectful nod, the kind of nod a junior officer gives to a legendary veteran who has just saved the company, and walked toward the exit without another word. The other nurses watched him leave, then turned to Elena with wide eyes. "That was incredible," one of the younger interns whispered. "How did you stay so calm when he was screaming in your face?" Elena didn't answer right away. She looked at the empty bay one, where the floor was currently being bleached by the janitorial staff. She saw the blood being washed away, the room being prepped for the next person who would arrive in the middle of their own worst day. "Because the room is already full of noise," Elena said simply. "If I add my own anger to it, I'm just making it harder for the doctors to hear the heartbeat. Silence is the only thing that actually lets us work." She picked up her bag and checked the wall clock. 7:12 a.m. Her shift was officially over. As she walked out of the hospital and into the cool, crisp morning air, she didn't feel like a hero. She didn't feel like she had won an argument. She just felt like a nurse who had done her job. And in a world where everyone is shouting for attention, that was the most powerful thing she could ever be. If you believe mutual understanding matters more than winning an argument, comment. I will live kindly. The story of Elena Ward reminds us that true strength is not the ability to dominate others with volume or force. It is the rare ability to maintain your own internal order when everything outside is in a state of total, screaming chaos. We live in a world that constantly encourages us to be loud, to be aggressive, and to win every single confrontation at any cost. We think that being right means making the other person feel wrong. But in that emergency room, the real winner wasn't the one with the badge or the one with the 4 gold stars. It was the one with the integrity to stand still when the world was trying to push her. Elena proved that authority is often just a temporary title given by a system, but character is a permanent state of being earned through consistency. She didn't need the Admiral to save her. She had already saved herself and her patient by refusing to compromise her professional standards for the sake of an ego. The Admiral's arrival simply provided the clarity that the rest of the world needed to see what Elena already knew in her soul. We often overlook the people who hold the line in silence. The nurses, the teachers, the administrators, the quiet rules followers. We think of them as staff or support, but they are the fixed points in a world that is constantly shifting and breaking. They are the anchors that prevent the ship of society from being lost in the gale. You don't need a uniform to be a hero. You don't need a microphone to be a leader. You just need the courage to stand in the gap and say, not yet. The courage to prioritize the human being in front of you over the ego sitting behind you. Officer Miller learned a vital, humbling lesson that night. That perspective is the difference between a fight and a solution. He learned that the person you think is your enemy might actually be your greatest ally in maintaining the standards that keep us all safe. Elena didn't beat the officer. She invited him to understand the gravity of the room, and that is the highest form of conflict resolution. The next time you find yourself in a confrontation, at work, in a hospital, or in your own home, remember the tired nurse with the gaze of steel. Remember that the loudest voice is often the weakest, and the quietest adherence to truth is often the strongest force in the universe. Be the person who earns respect through consistency, not through intimidation. Be the person who values the mission more than the credit. Because in the end, it's not who we say we are that defines us. It's who we are when the double doors close, and the heartbeat is the only sound that matters. If you believe doing your job with integrity, even under pressure, is real strength, leave a comment below. And if this story reminds you that understanding can resolve even the toughest situations, don't forget to subscribe for more.